There we go. Hey, everybody. We are live on the Mental Health Warriors podcast, and we just want to welcome you today to the show. And here is a little intro to kick us off. Awesome. Well, we are back, and anybody tuning in today, be sure to subscribe, like, and share this podcast. We are talking with Sergeant Michael Sugrue today about winning the battle against frontline trauma. So, kick us off.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. A little bit about me. I'm from California originally, the San Francisco Bay Area. I come from a law enforcement family, and my law enforcement career actually started as a young child as a police volunteer, and I always knew what I wanted to do. When I graduated college, I went straight into the Air Force as a security forces officer, which is basically law enforcement, anti-terrorism, air-based ground defense, nuclear security, whole bunch of different cool things. I served all over the world, Middle East, South America, Europe, all over the US. I got out honorably in 2004 as a captain, and I went straight into civilian law enforcement back here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Walnut Creek is the city name. And while I was there, I served a bunch of assignments from patrol officer, training officer, driver instructor, detective. I was undercover 2 years on a state drug task force, eventually promoted to sergeant. And that's really where my story begins, is as a brand new patrol sergeant. The night after Christmas, I was involved in a very traumatic incident back in 2012. It was a fatal police shooting in which a man with a butcher knife was trying to kill a couple. And unfortunately for me, that incident forever changed me. And it led me down a path of darkness, to literally where I didn't want to be here anymore. I started putting myself in dangerous situations, hoping I died in the line of duty. And after suffering in silence for 4 years, I finally got the strength and courage to ask for help and started my journey of recovery from what I call post-traumatic stress injury versus disorder. And now I'm on the other side of this, and I'm on a mission to spread word that there is help, there is hope, and I'm living proof that if anybody can do it, you can come out of your darkest depths and there's a whole new life waiting for you.
Wow, that just gave me goosebumps. I will say that. Did you find that even when you were serving in the military, that you had some traumas or some effects of even that? Or was it more so when you became a civilian law enforcement officer that you really started noticing the effects of the day in and day out of the traumas being on those front lines?
For me, I really didn't notice the effects until my civilian law enforcement career. And, one thing to understand is that, and again, everybody's experience is different, but for me, just the level and the frequency of trauma that we see, I think is much greater actually in the civilian law enforcement world. We're literally, at battle every single day. Sometimes people work up to 30 years in this career field. And, we see just all sorts of horrific things from child deaths to suicides to horrible car accidents, violence, homicides, just things that people don't want to see or deal with. And when people call 911, they're calling on the worst days of their lives. They're not calling on the best days of their lives. And, in a typical day, one single officer can respond to multiple traumatic incidents. And so when you talk about a career, and I'll say all first responders for this matter, so not just law enforcement, but firefighters, paramedics, dispatchers, police officers, correctional officers, we're literally exposed to hundreds and hundreds of traumatic incidents by the time we end our career. And for me, I made a fateful mistake at the very beginning of my career that I would never talk about work outside of work, that nothing was ever going to affect me or bother me. I thought I could detach myself. And that really isn't the case. We're human. And when you see these horrific things, even though you don't think they're affecting you at the time, internally they're building up and building up. In my case, because I didn't talk about that stuff, because I didn't have anyone I really trusted that I could go to and confide in, it literally led to an explosive point where, I mean, everything was falling apart. My life was just, it was over. And so that's why I really try to encourage people not to do what I did. And a lot of what I talk about when I speak across the nation, or in our book, Relentless Courage, that I co authored with Dr. Shauna Springer, she's a clinical psychologist. I talk about learning from my mistakes and talk about what you should do as opposed to what I did do. And that's really why I'm here is I want people to not end up like I did. I want them to be proactive at this and start today and start talking about these incidents and start getting these things off your chest.
Right. So it's so when you look at like even military and like vets that come home after being in battle and war and all of the things that they've seen, it's what, 1 in 22 suicides every single day, right? Or every 22 minutes. Is that what it is? I can't remember how the phrase goes.
I mean, the number I think is much higher. Just like
Right.
in the first responder world, we have some sense of numbers because there's some nonprofits out there that track these numbers. But I think even those numbers are 3 to 4 times underreported. But the fact is that for active military veterans, active first responders, and retired first responders, I mean, suicide is the number one killer over line of duty deaths. So, being killed in combat or being killed on the job as a police officer, you're actually much more likely to die by your own hands.
Right. And I was just curious, like, if they separate those numbers, from like first responders and police officers, if there's something that you see that's higher versus like returning military vets that suffer from PTSD. Like, are the numbers even like close together, or is one way outweighed compared to the other, just because of the difference in trauma, if you will, that you see being on those front lines as a police officer, as that first responder? Like, is there a difference, I guess, in the numbers? But like you
You know,
said, it's probably underreported.
honestly, I don't know. I mean, I can't speak to those specifics. I haven't seen any studies that compare, military versus first responders. And you have to understand that even in the military, there are tons of jobs where people never see combat, they never go to hostile zones. Jobs like dental assistants or personnel people or supply. I mean, so, there's a big difference between a combat veteran and
Hmm.
somebody that served stateside and never was exposed to combat or traumatic incidents. And I don't
Right.
really want to take away one from the other. I did serve longer as a civilian law enforcement officer than I did in the military. I did
Hmm.
6.5 active in the military and about 14 in civilian law enforcement. But I think what matters again is just knowing that it is the number one killer for
Right.
both groups.
Yeah.
I think though the military is much better at talking about it and addressing it because they've been dealing with it for so long. And I think
Hmm.
even generally the public, they pretty much accept or even expect, many military members to have some form of post-traumatic stress injury. But for
Right.
some reason, the general public doesn't equate that to our first responders, our firefighters, paramedics, dispatchers, and police officers. And the realities are that we're both exposed to just horrific things that nobody should ever have to see.
Right. And do you think it's because it's almost like taboo, or something that just isn't like thought about as like something to even consider, if you will? Like, hey, our law enforcement is exposed to XYZ, but they're law enforcement. Like, that's what they signed up for. You know what I mean? Like, is there something that isn't talked about more so in that law enforcement line of duty versus the military. Like it's expected for the military, but then when you look at police officers and law enforcement, first responders, that it's just like, oh, well, whatever. It is what it is. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's almost just not discussed.
I do. You know, one thing to remember is that the military is a nationwide organization, and they have the Department of Veterans Affairs, and they have, a healthcare system, and it's all united. It's all kind of intertwined. When you look at first responder agencies, the culture is different. I mean, I travel all over the country, and depending where I go and who I talk to, some agencies are very proactive. They're talking about this, they're dealing with it. They have, resources. The officers actually use those resources. And then you go to some other places where they say they have the resources, but nobody trusts them, nobody uses them. And it's vastly different. And so that's what I'm saying is if you're talking about an agency, even in the San Francisco Bay Area, there is just hundreds of agencies here. And you look at each agency, they're different. They have
Mm-hmm.
different leaders, they have different chiefs. Obviously, there's not a united healthcare system for our first responders. And so I think that's part of it. But I also think that we as first responders don't do a good job in educating the public as to what we do. There's kind of always been this barrier between us and them, and we've never really let them into our culture to see what we actually do and what we deal with. And, that's part of the reason why Doc Springer and I wrote this book, because we're showing the true human side behind the badge and the uniform. And this book, I mean, it's saving careers, it's saving relationships, it's saving lives, but it also has the power to bridge that gap between our agencies and the communities they serve by lifting that veil and letting them see what's really going on.
Right, right. Wow, that is just very, I don't want to say like interesting, but at the same time it is like that they're just, because you hear about, say, on the news, like there's just this, like you said, that barrier, this wall, that there's like it's the police against the people or the people against the police, and that kind of a concept and mindset. But just that, in 2024, we're still dealing with that, like the education on the mental health, well, yes, has gotten better, but at the same time, those stigmas and those, discussions have not gotten better, for some degree. But people, in your line of work that are willing to speak out gives people that courage to be able to also discuss it. And I think that's something that is fantastic because it needs to be discussed. And I feel like those are the situations or the jobs that just kind of get brushed to the side, if you will. Like they're not thought about as being on the front line, especially like dispatchers too. The things that they hear on the other side of that call, and they don't
Absolutely.
necessarily know the outcome of what it's going to be. Like how, as a human, like you said, how do you not take that to heart? How do you detach yourself from something like that? Like I don't know how you could.
And I'll be honest, I was ignorant as a young officer, and I didn't understand the level of the trauma that our dispatchers were exposed to. And even like firefighters and paramedics, I would always think like that's their job, that's what they do. They deal with medical stuff. And, once they show up on scene, I can kind of take a step back and they now can take over, life-saving measures and whatnot. And, doing my work now, my volunteer work, speaking across the country, we're seeing all the same things. We get dispatched and sent to the same horrific incidents, and it affects us all the same exact way. It doesn't matter what our title is, what our position is. We're talking about humanity, and these horrific things would really affect anybody. And what we need people in all of our agencies, the leaders especially, to be open and vulnerable themselves, to address this and talk about it and share their experiences of how they've dealt with things and how they've overcome them and come out successful on the other side, instead of, many agency chiefs want to present this like I'm perfect image, I've had this stellar career, this perfect life, I have a perfect marriage, and perfect children, and that's not true. We all deal with things. It doesn't matter who you are, what you do, we all deal with things. And so part of this is, how can we expect our line level people to open up and ask for help when they really need it if they can't trust their leadership to do the same with them? And usually what I found, and I find this when I speak, is when I present, I usually have a line of people waiting to talk to me afterwards that want to open up and share with me. Now, imagine this, right? So these are people that have worked with fellow brothers and sisters for many years, sometimes decades, and they've never felt comfortable opening up to their counterparts at their own agency. And here I am, some stranger they've never met. Literally, they heard me speak on a stage for 2 or 3 hours, and now they're lined up to share something with me they've never shared before. And it just blows my mind that, like in law enforcement, we can trust our brothers and sisters to go into an active shooter situation, a horrible domestic violence call, a big bar brawl, whatever the case may be. But why is it we can't trust each other enough to open up and just be real and talk about things that are affecting us and bothering us?
And we had a question come through that why do you think there's a stigma of mental health in society?
Well, first of all, I think there's a much bigger stigma among military members and first responders. But I would say historically, saying that you need help or showing emotions, especially as a male, as young boys, we're always taught, suck it up, don't cry, don't show emotions, be tough, don't be weak. And so I think we learned early on that showing emotions, showing feelings, talking about this stuff is shameful, it's embarrassing, it's weakness. And that's how I used to feel, honestly. Like I was ashamed and embarrassed. And even when I finally asked for help, my like 2 years into my recovery process, I was still ashamed. Like I literally didn't tell anybody I worked with what was going on, what I was going through, because I was worried about how they were going to judge me or what they were going to think about me. But now that I'm on the other side of it, I know that day that I finally asked for help, that was the strongest, bravest thing I've ever done in my life. And that's really what we need to reinforce, is saying that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to not be okay. But what's not okay is to suck it in, keep it inside, and think it's going to magically go away. Because at some point, we're all going to have a breaking point, and we don't know what that's going to be. And for me, mine was that shooting. Before that, I'd been exposed to hundreds of incidents, but that shooting just pushed me over the edge.
Right. So, do you think that, and obviously this is totally opinion, but do you think that there is more domestic violence situations in police officer, first responder marriages that happen? And then the wife feels like, well, he's protected by the boys in blue. So I can't voice what's happening. And then there ends up being almost like the first responder, like murders of their wives or something that happens because it's all of this stuffing and they don't ask for help. Because you hear about that, right? So do you think that there is those situations that are happening and the wife feels like I can't report this because he's going to be protected by his boys in blue? Like, do you think that there's so much like hold that there is out there that things like that
Well,
happen?
first of all, let me clarify a couple different things here. So, domestic violence happens everywhere and to everyone. But to answer your question, do I think it's higher among police officers? No, I don't think it's higher. Not
Okay.
at all. As a police officer, I've been to hundreds and hundreds of domestic violence calls. And I honestly can't think of one single call involving a law enforcement officer. Now, I've been to disturbances and disputes involving law enforcement officers, but that's not saying it doesn't happen, because I've heard of it. I know people that have been involved in it, but I don't think it's higher. But what I will
Okay.
tell you is that first responders, to cope with their trauma and all these horrible things that they're dealing with, they often turn to alcohol, substance abuse, or even painkillers or prescription killers,
Mhm.
gambling addictions, porn addictions, extramarital affairs. These things do happen, and they happen all over society. And so
Right.
I really don't think it's higher among law enforcement officers, but it does happen. And is there a fear of the victims in law enforcement relationships? Of course there is. I mean, absolutely. I think that's a legitimate concern, and I think that somebody involved in a first responder relationship or marriage, they're going to automatically think that. But what I'll tell you, and again, I'm only speaking on my personal experience. Domestic violence is extremely serious, and
Mhm.
if there's evidence of domestic violence, I mean, we're making an arrest, and we're going to determine who the dominant aggressor is. And a lot of times it's mutual. There's two people involved in incidents, and then other times, I mean, there's solely victims that are legit victims. They're traumatized. They need help. They need resources. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
what I will tell you is that what I think can help prevent domestic violence in law enforcement and all first responders and the general public is therapy, is talking about this stuff, not letting it bottle up, not letting it get to an explosion point. Because, and again, this also will lead to bad police use of force. So sometimes officers, and again, most officers, in my opinion, 99.9% are good people doing a great job for the right reasons. A very, very, very small percentage abuse their power. They break the law. And unfortunately, they're involved in bad shootings, bad uses of force. And, in some of those, I think they could have been prevented had somebody intervened early on and seen that, hey, something's going on with this officer, something's not right, something's off. And instead of asking, like, how are you doing today, and just taking it at face value, stopping them, saying, hey, look, like, I know you, I've known you for years, and something's not right. And I want to help you. I'm here for you, and let me open up and tell you about some issues I had in my relationship or, on the job, and starting that conversation. But that can definitely help lessen domestic violence and bad uses of force. Absolutely.
Right. And do you think that there's a fear of if I open up to my partner or my leadership that I'm gonna lose my job? Do you think
Absolutely.
that is part of
There's a,
it, right?
there's a huge fear, and it's legitimate. I mean, I have people that reach out to me all the time from across the country, and I hear horrific experiences. One recently where an officer, and I won't say the part of the country or where the agency or their name or anything like that, because we got to keep this confidential. But this officer had reached out to multiple different leaders at different levels, and they just brushed it off. And they literally like didn't even take it in, just like said, you know what, you're fine, like just press on, do your job. And this person's life literally started falling apart. And it got to the point where a supervisor said, you know what, you need to take some personal time off. And this person had to use up all their vacation time, like all their sick time. They weren't given any resources. And they tried to reach out to the EAP program. They got some random marriage family therapist who has no experience working with first responders, because we need a culturally competent clinician or therapist. So they got no help. They went to one session, they walked out, and literally got to a breaking point to where they wanted to commit suicide. And I mean, it was months of this until finally, thank God, a new supervisor said, hey, you need help. And they raised the alarm. They got everything started. And now this person is getting paid to be off. They're aligned with a culturally competent therapist. They're getting the resources, they're getting that support. But I hear time and time and time again on how the agency has turned their back on first responders. And I talk about this extensively in our book. I call it administrative betrayal or institutional betrayal. And the whole
Right.
issue with this is it brings up unresolved childhood trauma. It brings it all right back, that abandonment that many first responders deal with early on in childhood that we never talk about, we never address. We literally forget about it. And then we find our new family, our blue family or our red family in the case of firefighters. And it's good in the beginning, like life is good, they're supporting us. But then it's at that moment when we need them most and they turn their back on us. In my
Mhm.
opinion, that's the issue that leads to suicide. It's not, I mean, the horrific things we see and deal with, don't get me wrong, it has an absolute effect. It does, and it needs to be dealt with. But that breaking point, that thing that pushes us over the edge into suicide, in my opinion, is the administrative betrayal or the institutional betrayal.
Wow. And, like, again, that's not something that the regular Joe Schmo, if you will, even knows about or thinks about. And I feel like you are doing amazing work bringing this to stages and writing the book and just bringing the awareness because I had no idea, I mean, knowing that there's always been that stigma of mental health, like, let's be honest, and then, of course, especially for men asking for help, like you said, it's a sign of weakness is what society makes, you feel like, you can't ask for help because you're a man, you're supposed to be strong, you're supposed to have it all together, you can't show that emotion. And then there's, like, some ego and pride attached to it where, like you said, it's that weakness. You can't be asking for that help. But then it's also, like you said too, that leadership that isn't encouraging their officers, their front line to be asking for help and being vulnerable. Like, what are some other than like therapy, what are some things that you have personally done for like self care, if you will, as a first responder? Because it's not just women that need self care, right? So, as a man, like, what are other things other than therapy that you have done to take better care of yourself to help just kind of ease that burden, if you will?
So, first of all, you're right that it takes basically a multi-layered approach to deal with post-traumatic stress injury. There's not one thing that's a cure-all and that helps everybody. And so you have to try different things. You have to step out of your comfort zone. And so first, I'm going to talk about the things I did to get better, and then I'll talk about the things that I do to maintain my mental health. And so for me, I'm a culturally competent clinician and therapist. And then I learned about these first responder support meetings, which were confidential meetings that were run by volunteers who are all first responders. There's no last names used, no agencies, and it's a discussion meeting. So I started going to those every single week. I learned about a program called the West Coast Post Trauma Retreat. It's a week-long residential treatment program for first responders. I went through that. It was absolutely life-changing. I did try medication. I did things like equine therapy. I've tried EMDR. I've had a stellate ganglion block, which is a medical procedure to treat the physical symptoms of post-traumatic stress. I talk about that extensively in the book, as well as Doc Springer. Um, you know, that was most of it. But on the other side of it, to maintain it, I work out every single day. I mean, literally, I just came from the gym before doing this interview. I'm still in my gym clothes, and I work out 2 hours a day. Usually, I work out with a partner. I've got one buddy who's a veteran, another buddy who's an active police officer. And so, not only are we working out, but I've got good, solid friends who I can talk to about anything and everything. I mean, whether it's health problems, financial issues, relationship problems, family problems. So I'm getting that physical workout, but I've also got that person that I can confide in. And so that is extremely helpful. And typically, when I get home from the gym, I take my dog for a walk outside, just relax, come back, I meditate. I meditate every single day, and not for a long time. Sometimes it's only 15 minutes, sometimes it's up to a half hour. I've also practiced gratitude, which is huge. So every night before I go to bed, I think of three positive things that happened in the day. And literally everyone can think of three positive things. Like some days it's not all that exciting. It's like I got out of bed, I didn't have any physical pain today, you know. Or it could be like I went to lunch with my buddy, or I saw my mom and had dinner with her, or I got to go to a Giants game. My fiance came over and we got to watch a movie and hang out and relax. Just these things. You think of three positive things, and that trains your brain to think of positivity and good things before you go to sleep. Because naturally, I would always think of the bad things, and I would always think of
Right.
the worst case scenario. And so it takes time, it takes work, but over time, it really does change, and it lessens nightmares, night terrors. You wake up feeling better in a better mood.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, those are fantastic things, and I think that, um, that's something else that needs to be discussed more, where it isn't just self-care for women. I talk a lot about self-care. As you can see, I'm known as the self-care mama, but typically it's talking about self-care for moms. But I recently started talking about the self-care for dads as well, and just recognizing when men need some self-care. Like when you can see the exhaustion and the stress and the pent up emotion, if you will, like that a break needs to happen. Otherwise, a big break is going to happen and it's not going to be the good kind, right? Um,
Yes.
so it's really just it's recognizing that. So it's a conversation, I think, and a lot of times we're so afraid of, like you said before, that judgment. So we don't wanna have that conversation. We don't wanna talk about the hard things because it's in the hard things that we really find out who our friends are and who our friends
Yes.
are not, right?
Yes. Yes.
So, I guess, do you have any, like, tips, if you will, about how you can like find who your people are, like who those that you can confide in, like what are some things to really look for as a man of, okay, this person is somebody I can trust, like are there specific indicators that you almost look for, or you know okay, this guy, I don't know if I can trust having that like intimate, like I'm gonna pour it all out to him, like how do you find that guy, if you will, to really have that conversation with.
Ironically enough, police officers are very good at judging people and sizing people up, and we can do that out in the field, but we don't do it with ourselves. But what I'll tell you is, it's really the genuineness of the people around you. And I'll give you one example. So back when I was a police officer, I remember an officer who was married, and they were talking about an affair they were having. And I remember other officers around them like pumping them up and going, "Yeah, bro, like good for you, like she's hot." And like that's a bad indicator. But a friend that pulls you aside and says, "Hey, bro, like what are you doing, man? Like you have a phenomenal wife, you have beautiful kids at home, they care about you, they've got your back, like why are you doing this?" So they're literally taking you aside, they're not embarrassing you, they're not calling you out, but they're having a heart to heart discussion with you to say like, "Look, man, why is this happening?" Like, because this isn't like you, and you're putting everything on the line, you're risking everything here, by this person who doesn't care about you, who doesn't know you. And that's the thing. So that's like one simple example, right? That's to know who cares about you, who doesn't care about you. Another example, I mentioned this earlier, but is the vulnerability. Somebody who is open and honest with you first, that comes to you and says, "Hey, bro, like, man, I'm having issues at home and I don't know what to do. Like, I come home pissed off every day and my family's walking around on eggshells around me. And I think my wife's gonna leave me." And that friend steps in and says, "Hey, let me tell you what I did. Let me tell you about some resources or a great counselor, or maybe you should read this book, or have you thought about talking about this here?" But they're showing that they care about you, right? And you
Right.
can apply this to anybody, no matter what your field is, no matter where you work. There's people that care about you, and there's people that pretend like they care about you. And I learned this the hard way. Ironically enough, true story. So, like 2 weeks ago, I was out with my family, my fiance, my brother, my mom, and my aunt. There was this big, like, all day wine tasting event where I live. And I ran into three people I used to work with, that I hadn't seen in years. And I liked them. I thought we had a good relationship. One of them, we had a couple issues, but the other two, we never had any issues. And I remember I've reached out to them, I've sent them texts, like I tried talking to them, and I ran into them. They're all like fake and happy and pretending like. And so after we left, I sent them a text message saying, "Hey, it was really good seeing you. Like we should meet for coffee or lunch sometime." Didn't respond, right? And it's just like it's typical. It's like a lot of people are phony and they're fake. And one thing I noticed for me personally between the military and law enforcement, I thought there was a much more sense of family and camaraderie in the military. And I actually have a lot more friends from the military that I still keep in touch with, who I'm closer to, who I feel bonded with, where honestly, in the law enforcement world, it was very cutthroat. It was very competitive. Like in my agency, when an opening came up for something, an assignment, it was like everyone was out for themselves. And it's disheartening when you think about it. I hate to say it, but it's the reality of what I experienced, and I hear it all the time. And so, as much as we'd all like to have this big circle of friends, in reality, I have a handful of true friends, ones that I know have my back, ones that I know I can call or text 24/7, that will drop whatever they're doing to help me out. And that's the harsh reality. And like I said, there's people to this day, if they see me, they'll walk the other way. They won't talk to me. They'll treat me like I've got a plague because I had post traumatic stress injury and I'm crazy, and they don't want to be associated with me. And it's really sad. But what I've learned is that those people are actually struggling themselves, and they haven't come to terms with it. And so I used to kind of be angry and pissed off, but now I actually have compassion for them, and I hope that they actually get the help they need someday, that they actually realize that it's normal, it's human, and that nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes. And yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's straight from my heart and straight from my experience.
Wow. That well, and it's so funny, if you will. I mean, it really isn't, but like that there's such a competitiveness. Like I get it. There's a lot of testosterone, let's be true here. But just like like you said, if there's an opening, it becomes so cutthroat, and openings probably don't happen that much, but at the same
No,
time, you hear that there's such a shortage of police officers. But then it's like, okay, if there's such a shortage, why aren't there more openings then? But again, it comes down to government funding and all of those types of things as well. So, it's fascinating to me that there still has to be such a stigma in 2024 about that asking for help, and that everybody's fighting a battle. Everybody
yes.
is. But it's whether or not you're going to drop the mask and you're going to ask for that help. And do you think that when, because you didn't typically see it before, but when the commercials about, what was it, the Ryan Phelps commercial that came out as far as like mental health, do you think that there was an increase in men, especially, starting to ask for help after commercials and a lot of awareness started coming out about mental health? Do you think that helped, if you will? Like, hey, it's okay to ask for help.
It absolutely helps, and it's not just that it's commercial. What it is, it's people that we look up to and that we admire. And
Mhm.
I'll use an example. It was the senior enlisted advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Staffs of the military. He was Air Force pararescue. He just retired, but he actually came out. He did interviews. He talked about his mental health struggles while in the military. And this guy was like the baddest of the baddest. This guy is like a hero. This guy is a stud. And he is the epitome of what it means to be an all American hero, right? And so when people like that come out and they show their vulnerability, that's what allows people to open up. That's what allows people to say, if they can do it, I can do it. And the reason they do that, like I said, is because they respect them, they look up to them, they admire them. And so, and that's different for everybody. But think about in a police department, right? If you have a police chief, especially the young officers just in, a police chief is like God. Like you look at them like, almost like a father figure. Like this is the person that you dream of being someday, like 20 years from now, right? And if that person is, like you said, out there on Front Street and talking about their struggles and talking about how they dealt with, how they overcame it, that's where the power is. That's what allows people to do the same because it builds trust. And trust is key in this whole conversation. There has to be absolute trust. And you have to know that it's not going to be used against you, that there's not going to be negative ramifications on promotions, on assignments, on your career as a whole. And right now, unfortunately, there is that stigma that if I ask for help, I'm not going to get promoted. I'm not going to get special assignments. I may be forced to retire, like my agency tried to do when I was in the middle of trying to get better and my goal was to come back. I had an administrator who started talking about retiring when I had no intention of ever retiring. Like literally, this is all I've known since being a child. And my goal, I was doing everything I could to come back, but it wasn't quick or fast enough for them. And so they're like, we're going to get rid of you. We don't care about the many years of hard work and dedication that you put into this, putting your life on the line every single day. That doesn't matter. We want you out of here.
Yeah, it becomes more of like that numbers and the dollars and cents game then,
Yes.
like not about the people, which then, you know, can lead to turnover, if you will, if you're going to force the good police officers out, and then you've got less experienced officers coming on the job, and then they find, whoa, like this isn't necessarily what I thought I was getting myself into, but at the same time, that's what you train for, right? Um,
Well,
let's see if
I'll tell
we
you this. You mentioned this earlier, but almost every law enforcement agency is understaffed right now in the United States. And it has nothing
mhm.
to do with budget or money. It doesn't. There's agencies here in the Bay Area giving $75,000 signing bonuses for people to be police officers. The reality is, and I'm going to bring up something controversial, but ever since the George Floyd incident and the start of BLM, there has been a huge division of people in the community, politicians, police chiefs, who have literally abandoned their officers and put them on an island. And so what it comes down to is nobody wants to do this job anymore. Not only are you putting your life on the line every single day for complete strangers, and we're willing to do that, but now you've got nobody backing you up or supporting you. I mean, look at my example. I was involved in a shooting where we saved the lives of a couple. I mean, literally, a guy with a butcher knife broke into a condo, was trying to kill a poor couple, barricaded inside their bedroom. He was stabbing through the door with a butcher knife. And then he tried to kill myself and my officers. And even with that being said, and we had the victims who survived, they testified, we endured a 4-year federal lawsuit, $15 million lawsuit. I was defendant in San Francisco in 2016, 4 years after my shooting, on trial for 2 weeks. And that was a good, justified shooting. We were cleared by internal investigators, by the district attorney, and we did win the trial. We won the trial. But that's what I'm saying is that as a police officer, especially, every car we pull over, every call we go to, every person we talk to on the street, it's a potential complaint, it's a potential internal investigation, it's a potential lawsuit. Not to mention, it's a potential chance to be killed, right? Because
Yeah,
every contact is a potential lethal threat. And so right now, nobody wants to do the job. And so that's where we
right.
need to start supporting our officers. If you want to fill our departments, if you want full staffing, then we need police leaders and government leaders who are going to support our first responders to the fullest.
Right. And that is an excellent point. Like, you see the inflation, let's be honest, of what the media makes everything look out to be, right? And I often, even driving in a car as a white person, right? Like, if I'm going to get pulled over, I'm not going to lie to the police officer pulling me over, because lying is, what is that going to get you? Right? It's following their instructions. Do what they instruct you to do, whether you're white or you're black. It doesn't matter. If you're given an instruction, why do you have to fight it? Why do you have to portray to be sketchy? Like, and that's where you see, oh, well, this person was doing this. And then, yeah, you've got the white cops against the black community or vice versa. When in reality, it's, again, controversial, black community killing black community, not necessarily police officer, black community shooting. And yes, that's probably going to piss a lot of people off, but that's the reality. And nobody wants to admit that or look at it, right? So, like how do you get past that as a society? Like
Well,
how do you do that?
and I talked about this earlier, but in our book as an example, but we need to let the community in. We need to show them who we are as people, as parents, as husbands and wives, as brothers and sisters. We need to show them the real people that we are, that we care, that we have feelings, that we have emotions, that, we just want to go home safely to our family every night. That's our goal, is to go home safely. We have policies and procedures in place. Like when we make a high risk car stop, if somebody's driving a stolen car, or if they have a felony warrant, or if they're a suspect in a robbery that just occurred, we have procedures that we have in place, like you said, where we give instructions, we give commands to keep everybody safe and to keep everybody alive. And we want people to listen. We want people to comply. We don't want people to resist. We don't want people to fight. And unfortunately, if you look at most like fatal police incidents, probably 99% of them could have been avoided if the person just complied or listened. I mean, that is the reality. And that has nothing to do with race. It literally has to do with the crime that you're committing or what you're a suspect of. And there's police procedures. But again, we need to educate the public on our procedures, on things that we have to do, why we do it, and things that we can do to do better too. Is that, like, let's say I stop you and you're in a rental car that came back stolen. You didn't steal it, but the rental car company screwed up, but we still brought you out at gunpoint. We handcuffed you until we could figure out what was going on. Okay, well, once we find out the car's not stolen, obviously we take the handcuffs off, but then we take the time to talk to you person to person and say, look, first of all, let me tell you why this happened. Let me tell you why we did what we did. But we're taking that extra time on the back end to educate the public to say, look, here's why we did this. We didn't know who you were. We didn't know if you're wanted for murder. This is the information we had. It was what we thought was good information, and we acted, faithfully on it. And
Right.
that's part of the process too. Is it's that mutual communication where we've got to do better, and we got to take ownership as law enforcement to do better in educating the public.
Right, and I think, like you said, it's not even ownership too from the officers, but it's ownership from the people. Like, if you know you did something wrong, why are you trying to lie to get out of it? Like, you're caught, right? And I often tell my kids, like, if you tell the truth up front, you're in less trouble when you tell the truth up front than if you're gonna lie to me. So, because I already know the answer, I'm mom. Like, mom already knows what you did. But it's one of those things of taking the responsibility. And I feel like in today's society, there's none of that. Nobody wants to take responsibility. It was his fault. It was her fault. It was this person. It was that person. Versus like, hello, when you point the finger, you've got what, three pointing back at you? Like, take the ownership and take the responsibility. And do you think that those are the things that aren't taught in homes anymore?
Well, I know in some communities, kids are raised to hate police officers. That's the
Mhm.
reality of it. I know in other communities, they're raised to respect them and to listen to them. And part of that too is, and there's a big controversy, but in here in California, there was this big thing where everybody wanted cops out of the schools. The school resource officers. Everybody had this wave of just like, get rid of the cops. They're causing all the problems. They're targeting students. They're causing situations. And guess what? Crime started to dramatically increase. Fights at schools, guns on campus, knives on campus, teachers getting threatened. And so now there's this huge outcry to say, like, no, we want the cops back in school, right? And it's just this thing of like, the cops aren't the problem. Like you said, it's usually what's going on at home. It's how people are raised. It's who their role models are. It's what they're taught at a young age, how to talk to police officers, or to resist, or to run away. This is where we need to change things. And even, like where I worked, we brought police officers into elementary schools, and we would read books to children, and we would bring like presents on Christmas. We'd let them see our police cars and our canines, and we would build programs so that they would actually see the things that we do and get to know us. and like us and respect us. And so I think we need to do more of that. But again, with understaffing, right, with every department understaffed, unfortunately, most officers don't have the time to be able to even do those things anymore.
Right. That is so in Wisconsin, that's where I am. Like, it's so interesting. Like, we've got some high schools here that don't even have metal detectors. And we've got school shootings that you typically don't hear about, but it's gang member, drug dealer, all the things, but they happen. You just don't necessarily hear about it. But at the same time, have you noticed that there is an uptick in school shootings that might not be mass shootings because of ghost guns in these 3D printers?
I really can't speak to the specific thing with the 3D printers and whatnot, but what I can tell you is that, I see constantly on the news here where I live in Northern California, fights on campus, people bringing guns on campus, knives on campus. I wouldn't say there's more school shootings. I think we hear about them more now because of the media. So yeah, I don't know. The 3D gun thing, I really can't speak to that. I can just tell you that, things are getting worse. They're getting worse at the schools. They're getting worse in the communities, and crime is just skyrocketing across the board.
Right. Yeah. It's crazy. Like, there was just a couple instances where I know when my grown son, who is now in the Marine Corps, when he was in high school, and there was like these gang threats of gang, wars and stuff going on in high school. And it's like, really, guys? Like, what's happening? What is happening to society? Like, and I know this kind of stuff has probably been going on, a very long time. You just never really necessarily heard about it as much. But now it's just like it's every week or every day you hear about something just crazy happening. And I think that to me is like, I don't wanna send my kids to a public school, like, no way. I'll keep them home, and I'll continue to homeschool throughout, you know, eternity if I would have to, because I don't, as a parent, I don't wanna put my kids in that risk. And you've got kids that are afraid to go to school or to even speak up and say something because of risk of retaliation, because of gang members or drug dealers or whatever it is, that they're afraid. Like, our kids should not be afraid to go to school. Period. Like, it
Like,
should not happen. And I think that is just increasing every single day. Kids are afraid of what the next person, and again, I think it boils down to what they're learning at home, their mental health, like all of the things, the environment that they're literally surrounded by all the time. And it baffles me that parents are so hands off on some situations and they don't know what their kids are involved in or what they're doing. It's crazy. The society that we live in just it just makes my head want to blow up.
yeah, unfortunately, you're right. And, my daughter goes to a private Christian school, and I would never send to a public school. I hate to say that, but I have a fear of her being in public school. There's no way I would let her go to public school for many of the reasons that you just stated. But I also have a brother who's a teacher, and he's been given, these overwhelming class sizes, and the parents expect the teachers to raise their kids as opposed to the parents raising the kids. And so, not to beat a dead horse, but many of this things start at home, and people have to do better. The teachers aren't going to raise your children. They're supposed to educate them. And, oftentimes they're distracted in dealing with these problem children. They can't even do that. And so as a society, we've got to get better. We've got to do better.
Right. Now, what is your thought on, because I know there's been talk a few different times when you've had like mass shootings and things like that that have happened even in schools, but like, what are your thoughts as a, retired frontline officer about arming the teachers? I know there was like a huge controversy and talk about, teachers need to be armed, if resource officers aren't enough, or, all of those things. Like, what are your thoughts on that topic?
Well, there's pros and cons. I mean, there's a lot of considerations. It's not an easy answer. First of all, anybody that has a firearm has to be trained on it, and they have to use it regularly. They have to be qualified. Otherwise, they become a danger to other people, right? And
Right.
I don't necessarily think that teachers with guns is the answer. I just don't. I think it's going to cause more issues and more problems. We don't need a fifth grade teacher pulling out a gun on a fifth grade student who's getting out of hand. It's not a good idea. I mean, you look at police officers, the amount of training that we have to do every single year, every single month when it comes to use of force, tactics, firearms. I mean, all these things. You're talking about thousands and thousands of hours over our career. And
Mhm.
so, having teachers do that, no. Now, do I think having police officers at school is a good idea? Absolutely. Do I think highly trained, qualified security professionals? Yeah, I think that's a good idea. But I don't think that we need teachers armed. I just personally don't think that's a good idea.
Right. That makes a lot of sense because yeah, you could, have an unruly fifth grader, like you said, and then, in that instance, like, yeah, that would be a terrible idea. Um, and obviously, there's a lot of red tape that you have to cut through, for all of those types of things, and you have pros and cons, like you said, to any of that. But well, we have, let's see, like 3 minutes left. So, is there any closing, topic, discussion, thoughts that you would like to share with our audience before we leave?
Absolutely. I want to talk about the book Relentless Courage: Winning the Battle Against Frontline Trauma. It's an international bestseller in Canada and the US. Overall, it was a bestseller for 34 weeks. It was written by myself and Dr. Shauna Springer. She's a clinical psychologist who worked with the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. But this book is very unique. Every chapter has two parts. The first part is my story all the way back to childhood until present day. It's told in my voice. But the second half of every chapter, Doc Springer comes in and she breaks everything down. She explains it, she validates and explains the physical effects, the mental effects on us, on our family members. But it is just a phenomenal, phenomenal book. It's available hardcover, paperback, Kindle. And last July, we released the Audible, and we actually recorded it in our own voices. And let me tell you, it is chilling. I mean, it is straight from our hearts and our souls. And when people pick this up or they start listening, they can't stop. And I guarantee, whether you're a first responder or not, a military member, if you know one, love one, it doesn't matter. This book is absolutely for everybody. It's on Amazon. It's on barnesandnoble.com. It's at walmart.com. So far, we have over 676 reviews. And if you go and look at these reviews, I mean, they're like multiple paragraphs long. I mean, changing people's lives. And so, if anybody out there listening to this or watching it, if you do get a chance to read Relentless Courage or listen to it, I want to hear from you personally. And I promise I will get back to you. I'm on pretty much every social media platform imaginable. Just type in Sergeant Michael Sugrue. I check my messages every single day, multiple times a day. But this book, it can save your life. And the last thing I want to say is that if you are struggling, if you think that it's only you, that nobody's going to understand what you're going through, because I thought that way, I was wrong. There is countless of your brothers and sisters out there who will know exactly what you're going through. And there's endless resources to help you. We have an entire resource section in the back of the book. Everything from confidential 24-hour text lines and crisis lines, which are staffed by first responders or culturally competent clinicians or peer support. But you can literally call or text these in the privacy of your home, your car, You don't have to give out any of your personal information, but just ask for help. Because I know if I hadn't asked for help, I wouldn't be here today.
Wow. I'm excited to get the book. I won't lie. And I think I'm going to buy a copy for my stepdad who was in the Gulf War. And he battles with some PTSD. Um, and wow, this was such a powerful show. I'm so glad that we were able to connect and get you on the show. And Adam even said, he's like, we need to bring him back. So we might have you back on again sometime this year, but we'll figure all of those details out. So thank you, everybody that joined today, the Mental Health Warriors podcast, Winning the Battle Against Frontline Trauma. Thank you, Sergeant Michael Sugrue, for joining us today, and we will see you guys next week.